Hi, and welcome to Coach Culker's Classroom. And today we're going to be talking about World War II, the battles. So, at the start in 1933, Germany is going to withdraw from the League of Nations under the rule of Adolf Hitler. 2 years later, Hitler is going to begin rebuilding the military and the Air Force, the Luftwaffe, for Germany. And France and Britain are not going to react, besides, give him a mean look. Hitler will then look over at the Rhineland, which was supposed to be a demilitarized zone, a zone with no military in it, and say, I'm going to put my army there. So when he does this and France and England do not respond, he then says, okay, I see how it is. He then makes the demand for Austria to surrender and become a part of Germany. Austria will say no. And when Hitler invades Austria, the French and the British will look and say, you can't do that. Or you can have that, but no more. And so then Hitler eyes the Sudetenlands of Czechoslovakia, a historically German part of Czechoslovakia, and he goes, well, I want that too. I want to unify all Germans. I want that too. And Britain and France will say, okay, well, you can have that, but no more. So Neville Chamberlain meets with Hitler and agrees to give Hitler the Sudetenlands and to promise not to take any more. And he claimed that there was peace in our time and we had just avoided another major war. Now, Hitler had a large concern, and that was the Soviet Union to its east. Germany had tried to fight on two fronts during World War I and suffered many casualties, and it was a failed plan by the Germans. And so Hitler signs a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union that both will remain neutral and to go so far as they would help each other invade Poland. Now, when Hitler invades Poland on September 1st, 1939, this is the official start of World War II. France and England declare war on Germany, but Germany's new strategy, known as the Blitzkrieg or Lightning War, works to perfection for the Germans, conquering Poland swiftly. Germany then looks to the west, not having to worry about Russia, and launches a full-scale invasion into Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, and into France. France, falling quickly to the Germans, soon left Britain all alone by themselves. Now, at the end of 1941, Japan is going to launch an attack on Pearl Harbor. We talked about this in the past video that Japan was never planning to fully invade the United States, but merely to knock out the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Fortunately for the United States, the carriers were not in the harbor that morning, and were completely missed by the Japanese attack. While it would take time for the U.S. to get back on its feet, the U.S. was not knocked out of the war. This leads us to 1942. Germany will officially hold its Berlin Conference, where it will approve the mass extermination of those deemed undesirable by Hitler: Jews, gypsies, mentally handicapped, criminals, political enemies, immigrants. And so, with Hitler blaming the Jews for the loss of World War I, the spread of anti-Semitism, the spread of anti-Jews, burns like wildfire in Germany. Jews are rounded up and forced into ghettos and sent into death camps in Poland. While the U.S. is preparing for war against Japan, a group of Americans volunteer with the Chinese Air Force to fight against the Japanese. A small group known as the Flying Tigers, known for the famous shark mouth on their planes, will be the first and few Americans fighting against the Japanese in the Axis at that time. With Japan's expansion being resentful of the U.S. possessions of Guam and the Philippines, Japan will then launch a full-scale invasion on the Philippines. Forcing 70,000 troops to surrender, Japan will force these troops to march 60 miles inland across the desert with very little food or medicine. Over 7,000 troops will die in what's known as the Bataan Death March. The U.S. could not stand idly by and needed to show that it was ready to go on a counteroffensive. So the U.S. will launch a small counteroffensive known as the Doolittle Raid of 16 bombers to fly over Japan and drop bombs on the capital city. This was not meant to be a major counteroffensive, but merely to show Japan that the U.S. was capable of striking. So these 16 bombers, loaded up with fuel and not enough to return, flew over Japan to merely put a pinprick in the Japanese heart. These planes could not return to the carriers as they didn't have enough fuel and would end up crashing in China, as portrayed in the Ben Affleck movie Pearl Harbor. Now, this didn't do a whole lot of damage, but what it did do is it changed Japanese strategy to show that mainland Japan was vulnerable to an attack. So with the Pacific theater firmly under the Japanese and the Empire of the Rising Sun, Japan is threatening not only the US but Australia as well. The invasion of Australia will fail at the Battle of the Coral Sea, where the Japanese will be defeated by the Australians and American Navy. And then, less than a month later, they will be engaged in a major battle at the Battle of Midway. 4 Japanese carriers will be sunk, thus destroying almost the entirety of the Japanese Navy, and show that the Americans were ready to take on the offensive. So 1943 rolls around. Hitler will then launch an operation against the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, launching a 3-pronged invasion. They will dive into the Eastern European states, conquering Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, but will be unprepared for the cold winter. This 3-pronged attack, one meant for Leningrad, the northern and only port of the Russians into the Baltic Sea, the center on target for Moscow, the capital of Russia, and the third for Kiev and Stalingrad, a major manufacturing center for the Russians, and then move south to the Caucasus to capture the oil reserves and oil fields desperately needed for the Germans' war machine. Unfortunately for the Germans, and by some smart planning by the Russians, the Soviets will go and be able to surround the city of Stalingrad and the German Sixth Army, forcing it to surrender, crushing the southern campaign. This puts Germany on a counter on the defensive, worried they'll be flanked from the south, and thus starting a massive retreat. The big 3 leaders, Stalin of Russia, Churchill from England, and FDR of the US, meet in Tehran, modern-day Iran, where Churchill manages to convince Roosevelt that it would be in the best strategy to defeat Germany and save Europe, and then worry about Asia. Now, the American public opinion didn't really care so much about the Nazis, but more about going to war with Japan. Churchill managed to convince FDR that Europe was in more grave danger. But a main-scale invasion of Europe was going to have to wait. The Nazis and the Italians had to be driven out of Africa. under the command of Erwin Rommel, colloquially known as the Desert Fox, England and the United States would have to go on a major counteroffensive at the Battle of El Alamein, preventing the Germans from seizing the oil reserves in the Middle East, forcing Rommel into a retreat. Rommel would flee to Europe while his army would surrender at the Kasserine Pass. From Africa, then the next step was Italy, just a short jump across the pond. American troops found themselves in Sicily. Many of the American soldiers that had volunteered were from Italian heritage and seeing long-lost family in Sicily and Italy, and therefore invading Italy was not so much as playing into a foreign land, but visiting a long-lost home. Sicily will fall in 38 days, and then the invasion of Italy will be a rapid success for the Allies. Mussolini will try to escape with some German soldiers, and he'll be rounded up and caught by a militia in northern Italy. He'll be then shot and hung upside down in the street for all to see. 1944 rolls around with Italy crumbling. The Pacific Theater is now the sole responsibility of almost entirely the United States Marines. They began a strategy of island hopping, jumping from island to island, worrying about those that have airports and runways and air bases. And those that don't or don't have heavy artillery, the Navy will just sail right by. So after a few battles at Solomon Island and Tarawa Atoll, the United States then begins to eye the Philippines. Much like it was in the late 1800s for the United States, the Philippines is a stepping stone to Japan and China. Now, in the Pacific Theater, as portrayed in a Nicolas Cage film, Wind Talkers, the U.S. did employ the help of the Navajo Indians, used as code talkers in a language that the Japanese did not understand or know existed, and then again speaking in a coded language of that. The Navajo code was unbroken in the Pacific Theater. Many of these Native Americans garnered respect from the United States, and after the war, while most had left the reservation in order to join the armed forces, few returned to start a life on the reservation. With Italy in crumbles and the U.S. on the counteroffensive in the Pacific, the U.S. and the Allies will then launch a massive attack into mainland Europe from England. Germany knew that this attack was coming, but they felt it was going to attack Calais, the shortest distance between England and France. The Allies then decided to attack at the beach of Normandy, however, were met by fierce resistance from the Nazis. Eisenhower's Great Crusade started with Operation Overlord on D-Day, June 6, 1944. Americans, British, and Canadians attacking the beaches of France while struggling to initially break open with the help of paratroopers landing behind the German lines and sabotaging the defenses. The U.S. will quickly break out and quickly conquer most of France. This is portrayed in many World War II films, to name a few: Band of Brothers, Saving Private Ryan, and countless others that are out there. So with the U.S. advancing to the German border, the 101st Airborne gets caught and surrounded in the Black Forest, with the Germans pushing as a last counteroffensive. This small unit of American soldiers managed to hold out at the Battle of the Bulge and defeat the last push for Germany back into France. American bombers constantly target German political machines and industrial centers. African American units are serving in the war, most famously the Tuskegee Airmen, who run 1,500 missions without losing any casualties, portrayed in the movie Red Tails. And I want to make a point here that many people ask, well, why did the Eiffel Tower not get destroyed? Why do we still have the Brandenburg Gate? Why do we still have all of these buildings from, the 1700s and the 1800s? Why do we still have the Palace of Versailles? It's survived 2 world wars. Why was it not bombed? Why is, St. Basil's Cathedral still in Russia? Why was it not bombed by the Russians or the Germans? And the answer to that is, if you are flying in a plane and a bomber, we tend to leave historic landmarks alone because they're recognizable from the sky. If you are flying over a city and all you see is ruins and rubble, you won't know where your target is. However, if you're flying over that same city and you see the Eiffel Tower, it gives you a landmark of, oh, you're in Paris, and you need to know where your target is. And so this is why many landmarks survive World War I and World War II. It is not that they were not used for defenses, but that they weren't bombed because they were landmarks for pilots. Now, with every war, we have war heroes. Vernon Baker will be awarded the Medal of Honor in 1997, the first African American to be living and receive that medal. Audie Murphy, the most decorated man in U.S. military history, will then get the Medal of Honor. He will also become a Hollywood star after serving. And so it's the last few months of the war. 1945 is rolling around. Germany is crumbling, as well as Japan. And so the big three get together in 1945 to discuss how we are going to proceed in a post-World War II society. They agreed to divide up Germany, and the Soviet Union will launch an attack in Manchuria for the Japanese factories there. Some historians argue that this was what caused Japan to surrender and not the dropping of the atomic bombs. So in February, the three leaders meet, and in May 1st, 1945, Hitler, with the Soviets arriving and fighting in Berlin, Hitler will commit suicide. 6 days later, Germany will surrender. America will become getting step by step closer to defeating the Japanese. However, the view of invading Japan was projected to cost over 1 million lives a day. To go door to door in a city with every man, woman, and child fighting against you was not something most politicians wanted. And so FDR passes away after February 1945. And Truman then becomes president. Now, FDR had been elected 4 times. He served twice before twice during the Great Depression, once during the start of the war, and he was elected for a 4th time during World War II. He dies at the end of his 3rd term, so he serves 12 years, and Truman is the one who decides to drop the bombs on Japan. Japan then surrenders a few days later. Many people argue with Truman of whether this was the right thing to do. Japan had shown fierce resistance as the belief in the Bushido Code that it was dishonorable to surrender. And most people criticize the dropping of the atomic bombs because more civilians died in the bombings than actual military targets. So with the U.S. dropping 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, this brings us into the Cold War. in a war in an era where we have the possibility of absolutely annihilating another country. Truman, Attlee, and Stalin meet in July to discuss what's going to happen. Soviets agree that they will get Poland and parts of Eastern Germany. They will not liberate the Eastern European nations as previously discussed. And the Western European powers agree that they will divide up Germany and try to install a democratic regime. Now, there are some terms we need to talk about during this era, two of them being the Manhattan Project and the Holocaust. With the Manhattan Project, technology is going to make great strides with equipment such as radar, sonar, jet engines, computers, penicillin, all of these coming about that will help save lives and make the U.S. more effective during the war. But the idea of splitting an atom does not originate in the United States. As a matter of fact, Albert Einstein alerts FDR of this possibility and the energy in an atomic weapon. FDR then organizes Dr. Robert Oppenheimer and several other scientists to get together and develop the first atomic weapons. We develop it in July, and then we drop it in August. We develop one in July, and then we drop the two in August. Yes, that less than a month after creating the weapon, we use it. Some argue of what would have happened if we had dropped an atomic bomb and it not exploded. So, with another term we have to discuss is the Holocaust. We had the Nuremberg laws passed in 1935, which forbade marriages between Jews and non-Jews, which is banning the laws, but it doesn't absolve those that already existed. Granted, it was unpopular because most people blame Jews for the loss of World War I. If you were German, that is. So in 1938, when the height of anti-Semitism is at its power, when anti-Semitism is at its height, the Germans engage in the infamous Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, where Nazis go and burn down synagogues, the equivalent of Jewish churches, kill hundreds of Jews, rape hundreds of Jewish women, round up thousands of Jews, and send them to concentration camps. Now, in these camps like Dachau and Auschwitz, some were not designed to kill, but either rehabilitate through hard work. Some were determined to be solely there for killing. Like we said previously, the Jews weren't the only ones that were rounded up. Homosexuals, physically and mentally handicapped, gypsies, criminals were all rounded up and put into camps. Many scientists are going to do experiments on them, and so unfortunately, many of their, as atrocious as these experiments were, the U.S. uses some of these studies, like how we understand the effects of frostbite and someone being in hypothermia and ice cold water for hours on end. We understand that not because we've done the research, but because the Nazis did this research on Jews and gypsies and people they thought were pests to their society. And so we use these studies even today, unfortunately, as awful as they were. So with Hitler, towards the end of the war, he decides to change the plan from working Jews and trying to rehabilitate political dissenters to just exterminating everyone that was a problem. And so Jews were sent to camps like Dachau, Auschwitz, as we've already talked about, forced into gas chambers where they were gassed with Zyklon B. Um, and many companies today were involved in creation, like Bayer aspirin, Bayer. Bayer aspirin used to make Zyklon B gas for the Nazis back in the 30s. And they have since announced apologies, but many companies that we still have today used or were a part of World War II. Another example would be Mitsubishi. Mitsubishi used American POW labor to make bombs and airplanes. And so, with the Holocaust, over 6 million Jews will perish, but about 5 million more gypsies, homosexuals, and handicapped people will be killed as well. With a complex coding of how you define and describe each person, whether they are Jewish, whether they are someone who has slept with a Jewish man or a Jewish woman, whether they're Czech, whether they are Polish, whether they're a prisoner, a criminal, a gypsy, a homosexual. They had codes for all of this. And so lastly, there's some people that we have to talk about for World War II and looking at the battles. Omar Bradley, known as the Soldier's General, will eventually have a tank named after him, fights with the Allied forces to help liberate Paris. Dwight D. Eisenhower, most notably the one we need to memorize, Supreme Allied Commander, will become a war hero like Teddy Roosevelt during the Spanish-American War, and then become elected president. MacArthur, who will have political aspiration as well, however, his aspirations will die out as people will be more inclined to like Dwight Eisenhower than the Supreme Commander of the Pacific Theater. And MacArthur was a little radical in his suggestion that after we defeat Japan, we should nuke China as they are the next major threat in the world. Yes, that was something he wanted to do. Chester Nimitz, fellow Texan that may see it pop up somewhere on a test. There's commander at the Battle of Midway in turning the U.S. onto the offensive against Japan. He has a museum named after him in Fredericksburg, Texas. George Marshall, who helped organize the victory with Dwight D. Eisenhower. Patton, who defeats Rommel in Africa, and a brilliant tank commander who helps lead the final assault in Germany. Montgomery, a British general who helps with Patton defeat Rommel in Africa and helps lead the British. Of course, Erwin Rommel, as we've already talked about, the mastermind for modern tank strategies. And lastly, the Japanese admiral responsible for the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Marshal Admiral Yamamoto. So there's a lot of stuff that we have to talk about in order to fully understand kind of the timeline and the history of the war, but I hope this gives you a better understanding. Join us next time when we talk about the development of the Cold War and our relationship with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Until next time, I love you and I'm proud of you. Thanks for tuning in to Coach Cloaker's Classroom.